300 years later, archaeologists are trying to determine which of LaSalle's ships lies wrecked in Matagorda Bay. The answer lies below, if they can locate and measure the outer edges of the ship's hull. In these murky waters, the divers can see little. The archaeologists on deck see even less.
We've been able to go along the west side and determine that we've got about 40 feet of articulated hull structure on that side and about 25 feet of articulated hull structure on the east side. We're still trying to determine whether we've got the bow or the stern at each end, but we do have good narrowing of the hull, and we feel that we're very, very close to determining both the bow and the stern, although we're not sure yet which is which.
Until the divers find both ends of the ship, they can't be certain of its length or its identity.
Is it curving off at this radical angle?
It is curving off at that radical angle. I think it is because that's where the hull is approaching the stern post.
Yep, I agree.
And I tried to dig deep down, right where that screw eye is. So there's about 3 feet of the stern post there.
Excellent. Gosh, we couldn't ask for better than that. I'm just a hot dog. All right, Guy, well, you were in the water for a while. Let's get you out.
Locating the stern and later the bow, the team finds that the wreck is roughly 51 feet long. It may be enough information to identify the ship, if they can find this measurement in historical records. At the Corderie Royale, the Royal Shipbuilding Center, fragile documents from over 300 years ago are still preserved, including records of LaSalle's sleek coastal vessel, the Belle.
In this first register, we find the records of the commissions held in Rochefort concerning the construction of vessels, rafts, and so on, beginning July 1st, 1682. In the register, we find a reference to the Belle. Proportions of a bark named the Belle, which was built in the port of Rochefort during the months of May and June 1684. Shipping capacity, 40 to 45 tons. We have the length of the keel with the entire description of the ship.
The length of the keel is 51 feet, confirming that it is the Belle that lies shipwrecked in Matagorda Bay.
The Belle was a small ship with shallow draft, and LaSalle intended to use it for exploring all of the channels and bays and inlets that he knew existed at the mouth of the Mississippi.
Like the mouth of the Mississippi, Matagorda Bay is riddled by channels and inlets. It's easy to see why LaSalle believed he had reached his goal. The waters of the bay are also murky and dark, causing problems for the archaeologists exploring LaSalle's wreck.
It is the oldest French shipwreck in the New World, in this hemisphere, but more importantly, it belonged to a very famous French explorer, LaSalle, and because of that historical significance, we felt like we needed to do the finest quality, most detailed excavation that we could do, and a dry land excavation inside a cofferdam was clearly the way to go.
A cofferdam is a 360-degree structure that isolates an excavation site within 2 concentric walls. When the space between the walls is filled with sand, the water inside can be pumped out. Over 7 miles from the Texas mainland, the shipwreck lies in only 12 feet of water. The shallow depth makes construction of the cofferdam possible. Still not easy. More than 500 tons of loose steel pilings have been floated out to the site. They must be transformed into a solid and watertight structure. A specially designed machine, called a vibratory pile driver, clamps onto the pilings and forces them through the sediment. Only if they reach at least 40 feet down will the walls of the dam keep water from seeping under. Once the water inside is drained, the outer walls will be under tremendous pressure. 11,000 tons of sand will reinforce the dam and prevent a collapse. The sand is transferred from floating barges to fill the space between the cofferdam walls, one clam bucket at a time. After 3 months, the construction of the cofferdam is finally complete, at a cost of $1.5 million. Now, 385,000 gallons of water contained inside the walls must be pumped out and stay out. 36 hours after the pumps are turned on, the bay floor begins to emerge, opening a window that will lead 300 years into the past. The stage is set for the excavation.
You never know what you're going to find on an underwater site. Different weather conditions, different water conditions really do affect the preservation of a shipwreck. But when the water was pumped out of the cofferdam, I was thrilled when we went down there and looked around, and right there on the surface was this fragile piece of rope just exposed and ready for collecting. I know that the students with me had no idea what a rare find this was, because although I'd hoped to find organics, I just never expected something as fragile and as unique as a piece of rope.
The rope, peeking through a thick layer of mud, hints at what lies further below. If the bulk of the ship is buried and protected from the elements, it may still resemble a 17th century vessel. After a month of meticulous digging, the sunken ship resurfaces, its wooden hull remarkably preserved and intact. The fine silt of Matagorda Bay has enveloped the ship, blocking oxygen and the process of decay.
Rope typically doesn't preserve well in the warm Gulf waters. It just simply deteriorates away. On this shipwreck, we found actually several thousand feet, still coiled up the way it was probably loaded in the ship over 300 years ago in France. The rope had never been used, and yet it was in great shape today.
So, as each new object is uncovered, it is precisely mapped. The archaeologists shoot a laser beam from a fixed point on the cofferdam to a prism below, which reflects the beam back to the base station.
Using an electronic data system on the site really allows us to quickly and accurately plot the location of every single artifact. Every single day we can download the locations of the artifacts. This makes it much easier to create an overall map of the site and to understand the relationship between the artifacts.
The picture that emerges at even this early stage of excavation is that of a tightly packed ship, the top of the wreck crowded with wooden crates and rope stuffed into the bow. Outside the ship's hull, at the perimeters of the cofferdam, thick mud may have trapped objects that spilled from the ship.
All the sediments that we excavated, all the mud, all the silt, we actually hauled up in buckets above the cofferdam and had a screening set up on the wall of the cofferdam. And the purpose of that was to get the little small artifacts that existed in those sediments and to recover them. And in so doing, we found a number of very important things. We found artifacts such as glass beads, little pins, but we also found a number of other things such as the bones of rats and mice and the remains of insects such as cockroach egg cases. And all those are telling us a great deal about sanitary conditions on that ship. It's quite clear that that ship was infested with rats and mice and various kinds of insects.
The buckets of mud also contain small tools for use on ship and shore. Brass dividers measure distances on maps. This one likely belonged to the ship's navigator. And once they reached land, LaSalle's hunters might have used these tiny bells, called hawk bells. They help track and train birds of prey. Within the hull of the ship itself, signs emerged that some members of LaSalle's group intended to cook and dine with style.
That there are 3 cauldrons within inside this one of which is a colander, a very nice floral design at the bottom.
Wine bottles and pottery, wooden halyards and leather-strapped knives, all have survived through the centuries. But as the excavation brings these artifacts to the surface, exposed to oxygen and the stark Texas sun, they quickly begin to deteriorate. The skull, detailed down to bone thickness and muscle attachment scars.
The forensic investigations have provided us something really unique. They've been able to give us a picture of what this gentleman looked like. It sort of brings the whole experience of LaSalle and the expedition and the artifacts that we're finding on the ship to life.
While he remains anonymous, this man is now the human face of LaSalle's tragic voyage. He left Europe for the uncertainties of a new world. His dreams, like LaSalle's, were never realized. With his ships anchored close to land, LaSalle sent men ashore to hunt and search for fresh water. They shot marsh birds, wild pig, and other game. The herds of bison that roamed here encouraged LaSalle, for he had seen bison near the Mississippi. His young aide, Henri Joutel, wrote,
The news of the bison delighted him, for he reckoned that the country he had earlier discovered could not be far.
LaSalle set out to explore the maze of marshes along the coast, the first of many overland searches. As he moved on, he was disturbed to find that none of the coastal Indians spoke languages he remembered from his earlier travels. Hostilities soon broke out, and LaSalle's expedition was prepared to fight. Scattered throughout the cargo hold are thousands of lead castings, ammunition for their weapons. The larger balls may have been cannon grape shot. The smaller lead shot was for pistols and muskets.
Well, this is one of the muskets that we found. So far we have 2 crates of muskets. It's a very exciting find for us because we didn't really expect it. Even though the barrel is no longer here, you can see where it would have sat on the stock. This is the remains of the wooden stock. You have the butt coming down here, and even though the remains of the stock are not preserved, it would have been held in this fashion. The hammer assembly would have been on this side. It would have held a flint, of course. These are called flint locks. And when you squeeze the trigger, it would have dropped the flint, caused a spark, and then if your powder wasn't too wet, it would have hopefully discharged. State-of-the-art weapons for their time, really.
Near the muskets in the Bell's hold are crates filled with ceramic pots. They appear to be storage containers, sealed at the top. Further excavation and archival research revealed that they are actually weapons called fire pots. A wooden lid with a wick was fastened to the pot to ignite the flammable pine tar pitch inside. Within the pitch was a cast iron grenade to make the fire pot even more deadly.
The fire pots were really horrible weapons. These were used in defense. If another hostile ship came alongside, these would be tossed over onto the ship. They would immediately break open, and the hot pitch would be scattered on the deck and onto the sailors. The grenade would explode, and angular fragments of iron would go in all directions. These things would cause terrible burns and injuries to the sailors on the other ship. The injuries from the shrapnel, while they might not kill immediately, would cause terrible infections. And it must have been a little bit comforting to the sailors on the Bell to know that they had these horrible weapons to protect themselves.
The sailors on board LaSalle's 3 ships were constantly on the lookout for Spanish galleons. Spain and France were at the brink of war. LaSalle ordered his main supply ship, the Aimable, to be towed slowly into the safety of the bay. The captain of the Aimable, long annoyed by LaSalle's brash directives, instead hoisted sail in high winds. Uncontrollable, the ship blew fatally off course. It hit a sandbar, broke apart, and drifted into the ocean currents. LaSalle accused the captain of mutiny and sabotage. His aide, Jutel, noted,
According to everyone who was aboard the vessel, the accident was of premeditated design, the handiwork of someone.
Enraged and suspicious, LaSalle loaded his warship, Jolie, with all who questioned his authority, and sent it back to France. Now, only about 180 men and women remained on the Texas coast. To survive, they built a temporary camp in the marshy lowlands.
They exchanged the shipboard life for living in stick and mud huts beside an alligator-infested creek. There were all kinds of snakes and animals that they were unfamiliar with, so they traded one kind of misery for another.
Dozens of men and women died of smallpox, malnutrition, and Indian attacks, as LaSalle went off again, searching for his river.
LaSalle understood that he had made a mistake, that he had not reached the mouth of the Mississippi, but he was convinced that it couldn't be that far away. So he continued to search for it by foot.
The dream of conquest was by now a dim hope. Of LaSalle's 4 ships, only one, the Belle, was left. A small crew remained on board, with little fresh water or food, waiting for news from LaSalle. Jutel described their decline.
They began to fade, one after another. The longer they waited, the weaker their condition.
The contrast between LaSalle's grandiose plans and grim reality becomes ever more apparent. Deep in the hold of his ship are the goods which were to launch his colony and help it thrive. One box, fragile but mostly intact, contains what may have been the most important supplies of all.
When we found this in the field, we partially excavated it, began to see what we had, saw how complex it was, and decided at that point it would be easier to bring it back intact to the laboratory where we have more time to excavate it more carefully.
Okay. Here's a extra layer put in here for protection,
Yeah.
so we need to
Remove this carefully.
let me make sure it doesn't pull up anything with it.
Beneath the final layer of burlap, the archaeologists find hundreds of brass rings, mirrors, and combs, trade goods to buy favors and furs from Native Americans.
Trade goods are found real commonly on Native American sites in the historic period. You find a few glass beads in one site, you may find an iron knife in another site. But to find a whole box of trade goods intact is extremely rare.
And you can see there's a large mass of brass pins right in here.
LaSalle needed a vast trove of trade goods to further his ambitions. With them, he intended to build allegiances and raise an army of Indian soldiers to attack Spanish strongholds in Mexico. And for the missionaries on LaSalle's expedition, these goods helped spread the faith.
Thus far, we've identified 14 different patterns on the rings. They usually have some sort of religious significance. We find some that look like they have Christ on them, then 3 X's, and then IHS and Hoc Sigma, and then you find Loyola and various saints. So they all have religious connotations of one form or the other.
On those rings.
Okay.
You can see the
With hundreds of rings and thousands of goods all together,
and that's actually a nice bundle of rings right in.
this box could also have been the key to personal fortune.
These things were very important to the colonists because a small brass ring that would be very inexpensive in Europe, by the time you got it to the New World, it could be traded for a large tanned animal hide, and a bundle of those hides or a shipload of those hides back in Europe could make people wealthy.
But none of the members of LaSalle's expedition would reap these rewards.
Blijft u wel steeds wijs omgaan met de schatten van Moeder Aarde?
Why not actually fill the streets with bikes?
Your safest place is up a tree.
More tourists now go to Antarctica than researchers.
Aardwijzer. Milieubehoud, maar dan anders. Elke woensdag om 8:30.
Think of all the great parties that you've ever been to. What music was playing? Bet it was one of these tracks. Well, here they are, brought together for the first time on one collection called Party.
Wake me up before you go, don't leave me hanging on like a yo-yo. Upside the head, say hoops upside the head. Say it loud, say bigger the headache, the bigger the pain. Get around, get around, get around. Goody two, goody two shoes, goody two shoes.
CDs or cassettes containing the 100 best-known rock and pop tracks. The tracks that have made all the good times unforgettable. To get Party, you buy direct by picking up the phone. For your copy, call now. At Insight, we know great music when we hear it.
Скажи, пожалуйста, что мы не...
Mr. Baiba.
Minua. Okay.
Say Kogil.
Ça liegt zum Papa. Pierre.
Pas encore.
Pierre. Dan is het
Chico.
Dan is het.
Grenzen vervagen. Met Eurocall belt u voor één tarief in 25 Europese landen.
Vroeger al zocht ik het avontuur. Maar het avontuur kan wel eens groter zijn dan jezelf. Een boom toonde mij kracht en bescherming. En daarom is de boom mijn symbool, mijn passie. Dus kies ik ervoor daar al mijn tijd en energie in te steken. Net zoals ik kies voor Eneco-energie. De energieleverancier die past bij mijn manier van leven. Die net zoveel aandacht heeft voor mij als ik voor deze boom. Mijn energie, Eneco-energie.
Near the end of the excavation, the archaeologists see the final clues to LaSalle's downfall in the deepest parts of the bell. Here lie barrels of gunpowder and weapons that might have saved his struggling party. LaSalle was reserving this cargo for the Mississippi colony he still envisioned. The colony would be fortified by elaborate bronze cannons, now encrusted to the bell's hull. The archaeologists used the force of the cofferdam crane to pry the cannons loose. In LaSalle's time, Each of these weapons was as valuable as the entire ship itself, and a fitting symbol of the grandeur of LaSalle's dream of conquest. But he would never build his Mississippi colony, never expand French rule in North America, nor challenge Spain's dominion in the Gulf.
La Belle.
The Belle, 50 tons, 6 cannons, shipyard where built, Rochefort. Name of the carpenter, Honoré Mallet. Draft, 7 feet of water. Then we have this mention. Monsieur de LaSalle has taken her to the Gulf of Mexico, from which she has not returned. And there is another mention about this voyage written in the margin. No crew to be assigned to this vessel because the pilot, who has returned, has stated that the ship no longer exists. The Belle has sunk.
Exactly how the ship sank has long been a matter of speculation. Joutel describes a violent wind, but he was ashore and not there to see it firsthand. Was the ship capsized in a terrifying squall? Or did she simply run aground in the shallow bay and gradually sink to the bottom? The answer may lie in the remnants of the ship's hull. Some of the wood, pieces of bulkhead, mast, and bilge pumps, lies broken and loose. Each unattached timber is carefully mapped, then removed up to vats on top of the cofferdam. For the rest, careful tracings ensure that research can continue even after the hull is dismantled.
Well, we've excavated the contents of the ship out, and now we're looking at actually trying to bring the ship itself out. We've decided to take it apart piece by piece in exactly the reverse order that the master shipwright built the ship back in France 311 years ago. And so what we're doing now is we're actually beginning that process, taking off the planks one by one.
Even after 3 centuries in the mud, the oak planks of the hull are solidly attached. But once removed, the water-laden timbers are vulnerable. The team takes care to ensure that this rare 17th century vessel can one day be reconstructed. And the mystery of its sinking perhaps can be resolved.
Now that the hull's been completely excavated, we can finally begin to understand how the ship sank. It's clear that it wasn't some sort of dramatic event that caused it to capsize, which is what we often think about when a ship wrecks. Rather, it was the slow accumulation of situations and circumstances that caused the hull to fill up with water. We can see that the ship is laying bow down and over to the starboard, so that suggests that the starboard side of the hull may have hit at some point and loosened the seams. And the more water that the ship took in, the less maneuverable it was, and soon it settled on the bottom. And so what happens as a result of something as wonderful a circumstance as this was for us and as horrible it was for the settlers, we ended up with tremendous preservation and about 40% of the hull.
The loss of the Belle forced LaSalle to confront his failure.
The wrecking of La Belle changed the entire tenor of the expedition. They realized that they were trapped. They had no escape. There was no way to get back home. Their only route of escape was to find the Mississippi and go back to Canada. That was their only hope. LaSalle set out to do just that.
But soon, his search was abruptly ended. A group of his own men ambushed and assassinated him with a shot to the head. Then, according to Joutel,
they dragged LaSalle's body into the brush, stripped him of his possessions, even his clothes, and left his body to be ravaged by wild animals.
Joutel, still loyal to the fallen leader, barely escaped with his own life. With a ragged band of 6 people, he eventually reached the Mississippi. They made their way up to Canada and back to France. On the Texas coast, all that remained of LaSalle's expedition was a camp of desperate men and women. Weakened by disease and with few weapons for defense, they soon fell victim to Indian massacre. Their makeshift settlement was burned to the ground. But the record of their journey was preserved through time in a shipwreck at the bottom of Matagorda Bay. The archaeologists' tools are gathered up. The coffer dam will be dismantled in a matter of days. But it will take decades to fully understand the story of this voyage of doom, its leader, LaSalle, and his bold but thwarted ambition.
People may think that archaeology is just the recovery of nice artifacts, but archaeology is not really the study of artifacts, it's the study of people. They're little bits and pieces that you find of the past. Each one of these things has a story to tell. And when you take all of these pieces and fit them together, it forms a mosaic that gives you a much better picture of the LaSalle colonies. This expedition was really geared for success. They had plenty of supplies, manpower, weapons, trade goods, all of the things they needed. This wasn't a voyage of exploration. This was a voyage of permanent settlement to make a French stronghold in the Mississippi Valley. If LaSalle hadn't encountered all the difficulties, and if he hadn't perished, I think that France would have become a major player in the New World, and a lot of North America might be speaking French to this day.